Professor UG, you have stirred a hornet's nest. And looking at my predecessor's presentation, I expected it as much after having read both your papers, and that's why I changed my presentation, because it would have completely overlapped like the 9 or the 11 dashed line. Therefore, I thought, since I was going to be the last speaker, to only present to you a historical perspective in order to enable you to assimilate what lay before UNCLOS and how have things developed in the maritime domain and have come to such a pass, and what the future holds for the maritime community and the larger world. But first of all, I must clarify the meaning of sea lawyers. It's a nautical term, NAU, and not NAUT, and not NAUGHT. Sea lawyers applies to, actually it originated in the British Admiralty many centuries ago. And it applies to a seaman, officer or sailor who is arrogant by nature, has fixations and shouts down others. So because when I sent this paper to the IDSA, there were questions asked by some people outside who came to know from the title of my talk, how can you discipline lawyers who are defending various people in international tribunals for the law of the sea? Therefore, I thought I will clarify that it is now time for the larger world, since the Berlin Wall fell more than 2 decades ago, and people thought there would be only peace and calm. Actually, that peace has been disturbed, and it has rightly been disturbed in certain parts of the world. Since Professor UG made certain propositions in his presentation, I would like to put a preamble to my presentation, that in classical international law, customary or otherwise, the oceans have never been territorial. Well before Ambassador Pardo of Malta, because of whom the Third United Nations Conference was convened, who called the high seas as common heritage of mankind, it was accepted by the uncivilized world as well that the ocean is not a territory to be claimed by any nation or any state. However, there was an exception, and that exception pertained to the Mediterranean. You could put your mind back to 30 BCE and up to 117 CE. Remember the Roman Empire in the history books? They claimed the entire Mediterranean to be our seas. Mare nostrum in Latin means our seas. They also used an abhorrent term, mare clausum, which actually in English means closed sea. However, they did not use it as a pejorative. On the other hand, the Roman Empire, before the Christian era, issued mare clausum as an advisory to the larger world, that even though we have claimed the larger part of the Mediterranean as our sea, we advise you not to navigate during the treacherous months of November to March, when the Mediterranean is known to be hostile insofar as its weather is concerned. But the Romans were not the only ones to have claimed a particular portion of the oceans as their sea. The Nordic kingdoms and England used to charge toll tax, claim and exercise monopoly on fishing, blockade near seas to shipping, to foreign shipping, to claim that their areas were their areas, and that was it. In other words, might was right, and money made the mare go even at that time. That was the case of England in that era. But the greatest example of drawing a line on water, though not visible, though not negotiable, though not discernible, but declared in the world, applied to the Iberian empires. The Portuguese and the Spaniards, you would recall, these two empires, claimed most parts of the world in the Middle Ages. And therefore, their claims to certain areas of the world, because they had colonized those areas or were doing trade in those areas, were even helped by the papacy of the time. Who else but Pope Alexander VI issued an edict in church parlance called Papal Bull in 1493, stating that all mainlands and islands to the west of a line drawn 100 leagues, which meant 300 nautical miles to the west of the Azore Islands, passing through Brazil and Cape Verde, would belong to Spain, and those to the east would belong to Portugal. Remember the East Indies trade of the Portuguese and their interests in the East. Now this miffed many people in the world, but particularly the Dutch, who were most disturbed that their Dutch East Indies trade would get very adversely affected by this edict. And since they could not approach the papacy, I see many a smile in the audience. I hope I'm not hurting or pampering certain sentiments, but this is part of history. There's an exception I forgot which has been reminded to me by these smiles, by that papal edict or a bull. He said all mainlands and islands to the west of this line and to the east of this line will belong to Spain and Portugal respectively, except those mainlands or islands which belong to Christian kings. That was an exception. Now, the Dutch therefore charged a major task to a well-known Dutch jurist, Hugo Grotius, whose quote, "Liberty is the power that we have over ourselves." Very topical, very relevant, particularly today. With expanding on his treatise, Mare Liberum, the opposite of Mare Clausum, the free seas, and invite the attention of the world and propagate that theorem. Another quote that I would like to highlight, which is very pertinent today, which was made by Hugo Grotius: "A man cannot govern a nation if he cannot govern a city. He cannot govern a city if he cannot govern a family. He cannot govern a family unless he can govern himself. He cannot govern himself unless his passions are subject to reasoning." How relevant. Now I would draw your attention to another fact. When I was asked by Dr. Sinha to choose a paper in the session Ocean Governance, like all naval officers who are straitjacketed in their reading, I went to the dictionary to understand once again the meaning of governance. It had many meanings, from Webster to the Oxford to the internet. But surprisingly, when I visited the International Encyclopedia of Social Sciences on the net, you can go there, the word governance, which belongs to social sciences, is not even in the index. And perhaps that's the reason we are in such a mess. Nobody's told us the meaning of governance in the oceans. Hugo Grotius, therefore, in the year 1609, 4 years after he was charged with this responsibility, why is it not coming? Made this published this book, Mare Liberum, in the year 1609, and you can see from the cover it had many national flags. It shows that the oceans are open to every part of the world, to every nation state subsequently, and it is free for everyone to navigate. Now this book by Hugo Grotius and the Dutch received a lot of acclaim from the major part of the world, now peeved the British, who were affected very seriously because of British trade those days, which had already expanded because of the expanding British Empire. So they charged their jurist as a rejoinder, again a very well-known person, John Selden, Sir John Selden, who published, first of all, I must show you what he said in a famous quote: "The world cannot be governed without juggling. And those that govern the most make the least noise," which is a fact. This is the book that he published. He said very much mare clausum and trashed the theory of mare liberum, because the British had to protect their expanding empire and their already maximized trade around the world. So he said, where we go, Britannia will rule the waves. It doesn't matter if Britannia waves, W-A-I-V-E-S, the rules. Now, a countryman of Hugo Grotius went a step further, because Hugo Grotius, after writing that book, said that I also firmly believe, apart from freedom of navigation across the oceans, there is a need for every coastal state or maritime state to protect its territorial integrity, and it can do so only if it has a buffer zone, which we today call a territorial sea, where the law of the land applies, so that the buffer zone, why? So that you get some kind of a warning before an inimical element in the form of an armada or a sailing ship comes to conquer or to demolish any part of your territory. And Cornelius Bunkershoek, a countryman of Hugo Grotius, called it the cannon shot rule, which lived a life of 3 centuries. Most maritime states of the world followed a 3 nautical mile territorial sea. And why was it called cannon shot rule? Because the cannon, which had just been invented in those days, was found to have a maximum range of 3 nautical miles. So he said, whichever country wants to have a territorial sea should fire cannon and see where does the trajectory land, without ricochet, of course, without juggling, and that should be his territorial sea. So you will be surprised, till UNCLOS 3, many countries followed the 3 nautical mile cannon shot rule. That is to picturize what the cannon shot rule meant against an enemy. Now the maritime world, by now, because of Hugo Grotius' theory, had started craving for freedom of navigation, a buffer zone, as I just explained to you, right to exploration of not just harvesting fish, which is the next point, but exploration of minerals, which by the 30s had already known to be existing in abundance in the seas and the subsoil. The first salvo was fired by Harry Truman in 1945, just before the ink had dried at the end of the Second World War. And this is a seminal contribution, while others say, many people think that America ruled the waves all of a sudden 1945. He proclaimed that the entire continental shelf of the United States of America is under his jurisdiction, insofar as the seas, the ocean floor, and the subsoil below the seabed are concerned for exploitation of any kind of minerals, not just fish. And deliberately in this proclamation, fish was not included, because that had to be enacted by the Congress, which happened in 1976. Why? Because oil had already been discovered not just on land a century earlier, but under the sea. And by the way, in 1947 in the Gulf of Mexico, the first successful attempt was made at 4,000 meters. We talk of deep sea exploration, only an invention or a technology of the present decade. No. That was the reason. It was a smart move, but this actually led the UNCLOS to create the principle of a continental shelf in ownership of a coastal state, apart from the EEZ. Therefore, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, as a conference, was born in 1973, and after 9 years of negotiation, it was the greatest UN treaty or convention in the history of the free world. Why do I call it the greatest? Because it was a package which included codification of all the principles that I have listed over here, which meant everything to maritime states. The world was very happy. People thought there will be no disputes hereafter. However, let me go to disputes which predate the UNCLOS and go beyond up to the present day. The first one that I would like to highlight to you, you must have heard of the cod wars. As you know, cod is one of those precious species of fish. All of us have heard in this part of the world as well about cod liver oil, the properties of vitamin A, D, and E included, and in particular, the value of the palate, which includes fish and chips in Britain. And that meant cod was the most enamored species amongst fish. Historically, the Atlantic cod, which is a demersal fish, which means it resides at the bottom, was available north of England, but at a distance. But the richest school of fish lay along the borders of Iceland. Now, this was a dispute. It was not one war. That's why I said in plural. There were 3 cod wars between Britain and Iceland. Look at the distance between Iceland and Britain. 1,000 nautical miles, 1885 kilometers. Yet, in the year 1958, in September, when Iceland declared, looking at the rest of the world and also looking at what America had done to its continental shelf, declared a 4 nautical mile territorial sea to be expanded with immediate effect to 8 nautical miles, and that was its jurisdiction for fisheries. Now, Britain felt so threatened that it was denied beyond 4 nautical miles from Iceland, which was 1,000 miles away from it, that it deliberately sent its warships, some tugboats, along with a fleet of deep sea trawlers to go and challenge and carry out fishing up to 4 nautical miles, as you would be doing for a long time. Iceland protested, said this is the only source of livelihood to our, I'll take another 5 minutes. The only source of livelihood to our population, and therefore this is not fair, just because most of the cod resides in our waters. That's what cod looked like. So what did the Iceland Coast Guard do? When it found that they were deliberately coming up to 4 nautical miles, whereas 8 nautical miles was its territory, it started sending its Coast Guard vessels and other trawlers with cutters to cut away the lines of British trawlers. And the British had expected this, so they sent 4 warships in the first go. At the end of the year, the British Treasury Secretary protested to the Parliament that he had spent £500,000 in just oil for British warships, and there was no business of sending warships to an area which was meant for fishing by somebody else. But that protest was overruled, and the Parliament decreed that this must go on. So look at these pictures. This was the only Coast Guard Catalina amphibious aircraft which was used apart from 4 Coast Guard vessels, poor Icelandic Coast Guard people. And the British sent some warships. That is a British trawler trying to assault, physically assault, a Coast Guard vessel, which is a warship. Those were the kind of accidents unseen even in war in the First World War. Actual ramming. The mouth of a frigate, which is the strongest part apart from the keel, was eaten away as if a mouse has taken away the toe of your shoe. How did resolution arrive? There were 3 series of these wars. The first one in 1958, the second one in 72-73, the third one in 75-76. This is an important point to understand how dispute resolution can take place. Iceland was a strong element of NATO during the Cold War. In 72, when it found that America was not helping it in either giving it more vessels and aircraft for its Coast Guard, when the second Cod War started, because it had now expanded from 8 to 50 miles in keeping with the international norm, it threatened to withdraw from NATO. That meant it would have gone into the Soviet lap. It was actually offered some warships by the Soviet Union. So America came to the aid, and NATO's Secretary General landed in Iceland, and the dispute was resolved. Then, in 1975, Iceland expanded its fishery zone to 200 nautical miles. War started all over again. And it threatened to give away its only airfield, which was very important to NATO, as a refueling point for NATO forces, to withdraw itself from NATO and give away that airfield to the Soviet Union. The dispute was resolved. That's how things happened at that time. And they lived happily ever after. Now let me give you another insight into the archipelagic waters of Indonesia. These are the archipelagic waters of Indonesia. Indonesia ratified them in 1986, just 4 years after the UNCLOS Treaty. But in 1988, it blocked the Lombok and Sunda Straits, to the complete shock of the entire world, because most of heavy shipping from Japan to America and vice versa, including VLCCs, go only through these 2 straits. And they said, we are carrying out a military exercise, because they wanted to bring home a point which was very legitimate, that these are archipelagic sea lanes which belong to what they call Nusan, Wawasan Nusantara. That's right, which meant it's an integrated whole. The internal waters as well as islands make a whole. That's how you've called it an archipelagic state. That dispute was resolved. However, Indonesia made it a point to claim these 3 red lines as the only international straits, and not what most other countries, including Australia and America, wanted, that an east-west line. They said, we cannot monitor all internal waters which are being negotiated by the entire world shipping, including military vessels. Enough has been said about the Senkaku and Diao, but what happened in the Cod Wars happened over here as well. This is a recent picture from Reuters. This is how Cod Wars are being replayed, except for ramming is not taking place, but powerful water cannon is being fired by Taiwanese Coast Guard at Japanese vessels and vice versa. There are great maneuvers to be seen. Eddies also I will not deliberate upon, since enough has been spoken, except to say, you look at the overlap of the Chinese ADs. I am not blaming any country, because even the Japanese ADs many years ago was protested against by some countries in the area to be overexpansive. The reason I brought out this slide is there is a principle in air defense identification zone. The purpose of an ADIZ is to identify, locate, and thereafter control an aircraft so that your territorial integrity is protected against inimical civil or uninvited military aircraft, which means you can engage them. Now, if you have them overlapping with another country's ADIZ, that means that an aircraft which is headed to South Korea or to Japan is being challenged by you, which is not fair, not acceptable. The 9 dash lines, enough has been said by my predecessor, Mr. Nguyen. I would only like to say one thing over here, that it could be 11 dashed or 9 dashed, This is the first time, Professor Yuji, that I've heard, and that is from you, that actually China's claim is not for the entire area enclosed in it. But from the People's Daily to everything else on the net that I've been hearing and reading, it says that China claims 90% of the 3.6 million square kilometers of this area. If not, then under UNCLOS, there is no validity and no legitimacy of a line, even if you say it's only for those islands. Because by that principle, India should be covering a red and a bold red line from Socotra to Malacca, because our predecessors used to collect all in those areas. But we have not had a history of doing anything of the sort. The fact that the entire world is getting worried because of statements in the People's Daily and elsewhere, quoting official sources, is because freedom of navigation gets affected in that area. There's a great book written by John Spaniel, Games, Nations, Play, and he draws an analogy between human beings and nations. That's exactly what really matters. So, finally, mutual understanding, cooperation, and accommodation are the keys to a peaceful maritime environment, which should be accepted as a given. Are we in a Cold War scenario? No. It's already a warm war. Time for re-education and back to basics is what will put us through to a way ahead, which will be a panacea for all times to come. What is the way ahead? War? No. Peace? How? Joint development and exploitation. I will not delve into that example. That's been beautifully explained by her. It is one avenue. UNCLOS 4, which will take another 15 years, and there will be too many disputes in the convention itself this time. It will never take off. By seeking a review commission out of UNOICPOLOS, it's an acronym which I have made because the UN never made an acronym out of a committee which already exists. It is the United Nations open-ended, informal, consultative process on the oceans and the law of the sea. It includes all 166 states parties who ratified the convention, plus all NGOs, which is important. They can be converted into a formal mechanism to deal with the current imbroglios in various areas of the world. You know, for man, when he's troubled with emotions, there is always a pet to fall back on. Lend a shoulder to the pet and he lends his hand. But to nations, you have to realize that maritime nations are a blessed lot as against landlocked states. You already have enough. Let's live peacefully. The last slide. Thank you.